All right, what's up, everybody? Miss Lynch here, and I am back for raspy today. Back for part 2 of chapter 27's lecture. Okay. The last thing I had said, we had looked at NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and we were talking about factories beginning to build establishments along the U.S.-Mexico border. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start with our slide entitled Culture Wars. And let's look at immigration patterns during the 90s, pretty much up to 2000, 2001. Okay, so the newest immigrants. So because of shifts in immigration, cultural and racial diversity became increasingly visible in the United States. Put a SH on the end of that, sorry. Visible in the United States. And the largest numbers of immigrants entering the United States during the 1990s are coming from Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, okay? So everywhere but Europe, right? So for the first time in U.S. history, women were becoming the majority of newcomers. In the past, it had mostly been, single men or family, mostly men coming over, single or with families. If they were single, great, they were just on their own doing whatever. If they have families, they were often going to new locations and, establishing themselves enough so that their families could join them later on. So this is the first time in history that is not the norm, okay? So by the year 2000, 40% of all immigrants to the United States had a college education. Again, this was another shift that was happening. Many immigrants coming over prior to this, skilled or unskilled laborers, regardless, were coming over for work, and there was less reliance on having a background of a formal education. So this shifts in the 90s. This is something that has been changing since then. We're kind of getting to the point that there's a bubble in four-year degrees, and so that has kind of come about since the 90s. So does that make sense? That's, within a generation. So that's where we are today. Okay, so the new diversity. All right, so Latinos formed the largest single immigrant group migrating during the 90s. And between 1990 and 1910, 30 million individuals would immigrate to the United States. Communities remained far poorer than the rest of the country, which that goes back to what I had said last time. Our class divisions were just reinforcing themselves more and more, and we see greater gaps between our classes, okay? Okay, so only after 1965 did immigration from Asia assume large proportions, which makes sense. Think about everything we've talked about going back to the beginning of our class and, federal laws that had been placed against Asian immigrants, and especially in regards to World War II and Japanese immigrants and the internment camp system. Okay, so it's not until, 1965 that those numbers become more balanced, all right? Okay, looking at our next slide. Between 1970 and 2000, about 20 million people, which was twice as many, about 20 million people, which was twice as many Africans immigrated to the United States that had entered during the period of the Atlantic slave trade. Let's see, most African Americans remained in a less certain situation than Caucasian Americans or many recent immigrants, and the poverty rate for African Americans remained about 25%, which is significantly higher. The national average, well, 9% is considered high, okay? So like 8 to 9% is high. So 25% is extremely spiked, okay? Okay, so despite the nation's growing racial diversity, school segregation was on the rise because of housing patterns, which is something we have talked about whenever we were talking about the rise of the suburbs, right? Okay, but so housing patterns, again, reinforce segregation patterns. So since school funding rested on property taxes, poor communities continue to have less to spend on education. This is still true today, okay? That's why suburban schools have the most money, all right? So, something you can look into on your own, but that is a fact, all right? Okay. All right, so the spread of imprisonment. All right, coming out of the 80s, you know, there's a conservative resurgence and a tough on crime attitude is reinforced kind of coming out of the 80s and 90s and just everything that's going on in U.S. society, okay? But so, politicians' tough on crime stance meant a rise in the prison population, longer sentences, and more incarcerations for non-violent drug use, okay? Addiction was treated as a crime rather than a disease. And we are, in 2020, we're at the point where we are starting to look at incarceration and look at non-violent offenders, and we're starting to reevaluate the system, okay? But so this is very much reinforced in the 90s, okay? Okay. African Americans had an extremely high rate of imprisonment, still true today, 5 times higher than Caucasian Americans. And this came down during the 90s. This was largely due to differing definitions of crack versus cocaine. And for African American offenders in urban environments, so our cities, they would often be prosecuted under charges of crack, whereas as if it were, you know, coming from like a suburban pool party and it gets busted and people have the same thing on them, it's then referred to as cocaine. I understand that they're manufactured in different ways. However that does work, I don't know. But this differentiation in terminology of essentially the same drug, okay, will fuel that pattern of these more incarcerations of nonviolent drug use against particularly African American men, okay? So that will just fuel this fire that's already going on, okay? Just throw cocaine on the fire, which I think I was watching Disenchantment, and there's a joke about that, so I think it's actually flammable. Anyway, okay. So, all right, looking at this third bullet point. So for over 25% of all African American men, they could expect to serve time in prison at some point in their lives. Again, going back to this terminology of drugs, okay? All right, so the continuing frustration of urban African Americans exploded in 1992 with the beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles by the LAPD, which then resulted in rioting, in which 52 people were killed and $1 billion worth of property damage occurred. There have been callbacks to this in 2020 during the protests and subsequent riots that occurred in the summer of this year There was a lot of callback to, with the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, how much that mirrored Rodney King, okay? So this happens in 1992, and here we are 30 years later talking about the same things that are happening, right? Okay. So let us look at the continuing rights revolution, which, remember, we're talking about human rights as our large theme for the 90s. So in 1990, a newly organized Disabled Americans group won passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, okay? And then also in the 80s, but even more so in the 90s, the discussion of the AIDS epidemic, okay? So the campaign for gay rights continued to gain momentum in the 90s, okay? And this was able to create an avenue to have discussions about AIDS, okay? HIV and AIDS. Okay. So let's look at first Americans in the new century. Okay, so we are to the year 2000. I guess we're jumping back and forth a little bit. But anyway, okay. Well, so first Americans in the new century. We'll talk about 2000 for a minute, and then it looks like I'll go back to the 90s for a sec. But anyway, all right. So the Indigenous American population reached 4 million with the 2000 census, reflecting not only a natural population growth, but also an increased pride in identifying oneself to the census, okay? And this isn't just about pride. For generations before this, it was, a lot of people did not claim their Indigenous roots in the census because, for fear of public ridicule or fear of, repercussions from the federal government, because that had happened before. So a lot of people concealed that information, which is, it is sad, and it makes genealogy research so much harder now because people don't know a lot of truths within their family because they were forced to be concealed. So in 2000, we're finally starting to see the push away from that. And this goes back to the AIM movement of the 1970s, the American Indian movement, and pride, quote unquote, however you like to take that, from that point on, okay? So from the 1970s, by the time we get to 2000, this is a generation down the road, so we're seeing that shift, okay? Okay. Which brings us to multiculturalism. Okay, so multiculturalism was a term to celebrate group differences and to demand group recognition between different communities. Increased cultural diversity and changes over educational policy inspired harsh debates. Again, something that we're talking 90s, and here it is 2020, and we are still having similar conversations. But so this multiculturalism of the 90s inspired debates about, do we welcome change? Do we try to take the memory of the United States back to a nostalgic era that never actually existed? Anyway. Okay, but so the culture wars, quote unquote, that occurred during the 90s were battles over moral issues that raged. Pat Robertson, and the Christian Coalition were behind a lot of this. So, pick a group, they probably attacked it, all right? So it sometimes appeared during the 90s that the country was refighting old battles between traditional religion and modern secular culture. Again, this is happening today. In the 90s, this was referred to as, the battle over family values. So whenever you hear family values, that's what that is over, all right? Okay. So the anti-government extreme. Again, sadly, something that we are still talking about today because of domestic terrorism and groups that, fringe groups that are still trying to organize by their own means. Anyway, but so the anti-government extreme really pops up during the early 90s, early to mid 90s, okay? And this is something that affects us personally or locally here in Edmond, Oklahoma City. Okay, so at the radical fringe of conservatism, the belief that the federal government posed a threat to American freedom led to the creation of private groups that armed themselves to fend off oppressive authority. All right, so Timothy McVeigh, who orchestrated the Oklahoma City bombing, was one of these groups and believed that the bombing of the Murrah building would be fighting this fight, right? Okay, so the federal building was bombed in April of 1995. It killed 168 people. Also, especially being in Oklahoma, if you guys are not super familiar with the background of the Oklahoma City bombing, the Netflix documentary, it's just called Oklahoma City. I think it came out in 2018, but it is very good. It goes into Timothy McVeigh's background and his organization within the group that he was involved in, and then the bombing itself and the repercussions that, everything that came about after that. It's really good. It is very good. It's tough to watch because, you watch it and you're like, I am here. This happened here. These are my people, but it is very good in telling that story and depicting it historically and, remaining unbiased in its presentation. Anyway, it is good. Okay. Alrighty, so this takes us to the election, 2000. Well, almost. Okay, so Bill Clinton is impeached in December of 1998. This was in regards to his affair with Monica Lewinsky, which is something that I think that, we're far enough removed that historians can look at it really for what it was and less so blaming that whole thing on, a 22-year-old intern. But Slate did a podcast series called Slow Burn, and it's about the Clinton impeachment, which is very good. You're Wrong About, another podcast, has done episodes on this. Anywho, but so that is the end of Bill Clinton's time in office, and so that brings us to the 2000 election, all right? The disputed election. Still talked about, we're in the middle of the election right now, and people will still talk about, I hope that we don't have any repeats from 2000. Anywho, okay, so the 2000 election was between Al Gore and George W. Bush, so baby Bush. The election proved to be one of the closest in nation's history, and there was a less than a 1% difference for both the electoral vote and the popular vote. The reason people still talk about it and are concerned is because Florida always holds a large stake in the election, and it came down to Florida in this time. It's also come down to Florida in other elections, similar in 2016. But, so 2000, this comes down to Florida, all right? It then came down to, after that, because there were issues with polling and the methods that were being used, because it was becoming automated during the time, and all of that. So, issues in Florida, goes to the Supreme Court to decide this outcome, and then there is a 5-4 vote. So 1 vote difference, Supreme Court, and Bush is then in office, okay? So, all right, this last slide. So, exceptional America, and this is something that I've hit on before. Yes, American exceptionalism. And think about, I said this with World War I. Whenever we've gone over, usually with military operations, but whenever we go over and we promote the ideas of freedom and liberty and democracy, and then, in the past, prior to the Civil Rights Movement, specifically looking at people of color, once the war ended, we're then home having conversations about those same terms and realizing that what we were telling the world was through some rose-colored glasses, okay? But so, American exceptionalism is the premise of all of that, okay? So, all right, 1990s sees a rise in consumer goods, material comfort. Think about those manufacturing jobs that are going overseas, which leads to lower costs for consumer goods, so Americans can buy more, all right? That will reinforce itself. But yeah, so consumer goods, material comfort become defining factors of success. Okay, and going back to violence in the United States. I was talking about domestic terrorism, but I'm just going to keep this with violence stateside, okay? So looking at the 90s still, we had the highest rate of murder using guns. And in 1998 in the US, almost 12,000 murders occurred, which were gun-related, as opposed to 373 in Germany, 151 in Canada, 54 in Britain, 19 in Japan, okay? So 12,000 in comparison is a stark difference, right? Although not, the first active shooter situation in a school, but recognized as being the first widely discussed, especially televised, that's for sure. But what is considered to be, our first school shooting is at Columbine, okay? So in Littleton, Colorado, this happened on April 20th, 1999. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold went into their school and killed 13 other students for committing suicide. And yeah, this was televised in real time when it was happening. Yeah, so when this was happening, I was a freshman in high school, so it was like that would have been the same age group, but I remember coming home and this being on, and it was very bizarre that any of that was happening, in a school, and what could you imagine? And yeah, really the theme of this chapter has just been, and we're still talking about it, right? We still have to plan for situations like this because they happen regularly enough that it is still a concern for many, okay? Not right now, I guess, since we're all, we all have different things to worry about in 2020, but anyway, so that is, that's actually an interesting point, because who's to say what situations like that how this will shift from this time on. I don't know. I'm just thinking anyway. Okay, that is the end of chapter 27. I will be back for chapter 28, and then that is our last chapter, you guys. So, yeah, if you have any questions, please email me. Otherwise, I will see you back for chapter 28. Okay, bye.